Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In March of 1893, the Springfield Daily Republican published a brief notice that would mark the beginning of one of the most perplexing medical mysteries ever recorded in frontier America. The article, tucked away on page 4 among advertisements for patent medicines and notices of farm auctions, mentioned only a curious affliction affecting a young girl in Stone County. The family at the center of this mystery were the Porters, who had established their homestead near the small settlement of Galena in 1889. Robert Porter, a farmer of 41 years, had moved his family from Kentucky seeking better opportunities in the Missouri hills. His wife, Martha, age 38, had been known in their former community as a capable seamstress and devoted mother. Their daughter, Elizabeth, just 12 years old that winter, had been by all accounts an unremarkable child, quiet and obedient, helping her mother with household duties and attending the one-room schoolhouse when weather permitted. The Porter homestead sat approximately 22 miles from the county seat, isolated even by the standards of the rural Ozarks. The property consisted of 80 acres of rocky hillside, a modest timber frame house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Neighbors were scarce in that rugged country, with the nearest family living more than 2 miles distant across a steep hollow. The winter of 1892 to 1893 had been particularly harsh, with heavy snows beginning in December and continuing through February, creating a blanket of isolation that cut off many homesteads from regular contact with the outside world. The Porters were known as quiet, God-fearing people who attended services at the Baptist Church in Galena whenever travel was possible. Pastor Jeremiah Walsh, who kept meticulous records of his congregation, noted the family's regular participation in services and their reputation for honest dealings with neighbors. Nothing in the family's history suggested the nightmare that was about to unfold, a nightmare that would challenge the understanding of doctors, clergy, and scholars, leaving questions that remain unanswered to this day. Elizabeth Porter had been a child of no particular distinction before the events of 1893 transformed her into one of the most documented medical curiosities of the 19th century. School records from the one-room schoolhouse near Galena paint a picture of a diligent but unremarkable student. Miss Clara Hutchinson, the school teacher who instructed Elizabeth from 1890 to early 1893, kept a personal journal in which she described the girl as quiet and obedient, though prone to daydreaming. The teacher noted that Elizabeth showed competence in basic arithmetic and reading, but displayed no particular aptitude for languages beyond the simple English instruction provided in frontier schools. She was neither the brightest nor the dullest student, merely one of many children receiving basic education in those isolated hills. The Porter family's history provided no indication of the extraordinary events to come. Robert Porter had worked as a farmer and occasional timber contractor since settling in Stone County, earning a reputation as a reliable, if somewhat reserved man. Martha Porter, before her marriage, had worked as a seamstress in a small Kentucky town, known for her skilled needlework and quiet manner. The family had moved west in 1889, part of the steady migration of families seeking affordable land and new opportunities after the disruptions of the Civil War era. Neighbors who knew the Porters described them as an ordinary family struggling with the same hardships that affected everyone in that harsh country. Elizabeth helped her mother with cooking, cleaning, and the endless tasks required to maintain a frontier household. She tended the kitchen garden in summer, helped with preserving food for winter, and learned the skills expected of a young woman in rural America. The family's attendance at the Baptist Church in Galena was regular, with Pastor Walsh's records showing their presence at services throughout 1891 and 1892. Elizabeth had been baptized at age 10, and the pastor noted her as a respectful child who paid attention during services. The last documented appearance of Elizabeth at church services occurred on the 12th of February, 1893, just 1 week before her world would change forever. On that Sunday, multiple witnesses would later recall the girl appeared entirely normal, sitting quietly between her parents during the sermon, her behavior giving no hint of the horror that was about to descend upon her and her family. On the 19th of February, 1893, Martha Porter arrived at the office of Dr. Samuel Blackwell in Galena, seeking help for what she described as a strange affliction that had overtaken her daughter. Dr. Blackwell, the only physician serving Stone County and several surrounding areas, maintained detailed medical records that provide our primary documentation of the case's early stages. According to his notes, Martha Porter reported that the previous evening, during Sunday dinner, Elizabeth had suddenly stopped eating mid-meal and sat rigidly in her chair, staring straight ahead with unfocused eyes. The girl's parents initially believed she might be choking, but she showed no signs of distress beyond her frozen posture. Then, according to both parents, Elizabeth began speaking in what they described as strange utterances, unlike any language we have heard. The sounds continued for approximately 5 minutes, during which the child remained unresponsive to her parents' increasingly frantic attempts to rouse her. When the episode ended, Elizabeth blinked as if waking from sleep and appeared confused about why her parents were so upset. She claimed to have no memory of speaking or of the lost time. Dr. Blackwell's initial examination, conducted in his office while Elizabeth sat quietly on the examination table, revealed no obvious signs of illness. Her temperature was normal, her pulse steady, her reflexes appropriate. The doctor's notes indicate he suspected either a seizure disorder or possibly fever-induced delirium, though the absence of fever argued against the latter. His questions to Elizabeth about her general health, her diet, any recent injuries or illnesses produced nothing that might explain the episode. The girl answered politely but seemed withdrawn, occasionally glancing at her mother as if seeking reassurance. Dr. Blackwell prescribed rest and a standard tonic of the era, instructing the parents to monitor Elizabeth closely and return if the episodes recurred. His official medical notes maintained a professional tone of mild concern but no alarm. However, his private journal, discovered among his papers decades later, revealed a different reaction. That evening he wrote that something about the case troubled him in ways he could not articulate, that the mother's fear had seemed disproportionate to a single brief episode, and that the child's eyes during the examination had held a peculiar quality he found disturbing, though he could not explain why. The week following Elizabeth's first episode brought a rapid escalation that transformed Dr. Blackwell's mild concern into genuine alarm. Martha Porter's letters to her sister in Springfield, preserved in family archives, document the increasing frequency and severity of her daughter's spells. By late February, the episodes were occurring almost daily, sometimes multiple times within a single day. Martha described in detail how Elizabeth would suddenly become rigid wherever she was, whether sitting at the table, working at her chores, or preparing for bed. The girl's eyes would lose focus, her body would become unnaturally still, and then the strange utterances would begin. The sounds varied in each episode, sometimes harsh and guttural, other times flowing and musical, but always completely unlike English or any language Martha had ever encountered. Robert Porter, a man of limited formal education but practical intelligence, began attempting to transcribe the sounds phonetically in his personal journal. These transcriptions, written in uncertain spelling and crossed out multiple times as he struggled to capture the alien phonemes, would later prove invaluable to scholars attempting to understand the case. Robert recorded his growing concern in entries that became increasingly anxious. He wrote of consulting with Pastor Jeremiah Walsh, seeking spiritual guidance for what he feared might be a religious matter. The pastor's initial response, documented in church records, interpreted the episodes as possible glossolalia, the speaking in tongues mentioned in biblical accounts. Pastor Walsh visited the Porter homestead in early March to observe Elizabeth during one of her spells and to offer prayers for her recovery. However, his interpretation began to shift after witnessing the child speak continuously in unknown languages for nearly an hour, her voice taking on qualities that seemed impossibly deep for a 12-year-old girl. Elizabeth's own diary, a simple cloth-bound book her mother had given her the previous Christmas, contains fragmentary entries from this period that reveal her terror and confusion. She wrote of feeling as if something was using her mouth, of seeing strange images in her mind during the episodes, of words forcing themselves from her throat against her will. School records show her last attendance on the 28th of February, 1893, after which Martha kept her home, too frightened to send her daughter among other children. The case of Elizabeth Porter might have remained a local curiosity, dismissed as hysteria or epilepsy, had it not attracted the attention of Professor Owen Whitmore in mid-March of 1893. Whitmore was a respected linguist from Washington University in St. Louis, a man whose academic credentials included education at Cambridge and authorship of several well-regarded papers on ancient language patterns and linguistic evolution. He had built his reputation on careful scholarship and skepticism toward sensational claims, making his eventual involvement in the Porter case all the more significant. Professor Whitmore learned of Elizabeth's condition through a letter from Pastor Jeremiah Walsh, who had taken the unusual step of writing to the university seeking expert opinion. The pastor, educated enough to recognize that the sounds Elizabeth produced bore resemblance to ancient languages he had encountered in seminary, thought perhaps a scholar could provide explanation where medicine and prayer had failed. Whitmore's initial response, preserved in university archives, shows polite interest mixed with skepticism. He had encountered numerous cases of supposed linguistic mysteries that proved to be either fraud or misunderstanding. Nevertheless, something in Pastor Walsh's detailed description intrigued him enough to make the journey to Stone County. Professor Whitmore's personal correspondence documents his arrival in Galena on the 15th of March, 1893, and his first meeting with the Porter family the following day. His letter to a colleague describes approaching the homestead with the detached curiosity of a scientist expecting to debunk a rural superstition. That detachment shattered during his first observation of Elizabeth during an episode. Whitmore's journal entry from that evening, written in handwriting that shows visible agitation, describes his shock at recognizing fragments of what appeared to be Aramaic, an ancient Semitic language, mixed with phonemes that resembled Sumerian, one of the oldest known written languages. For a 12-year-old girl with minimal formal education living in isolation in the Missouri hills to produce even recognizable fragments of these languages seemed impossible. Whitmore immediately decided to remain in Galena for extended observation. His letter to Dr. Heinrich Steiner at Yale, written that same night, described the case as unprecedented in modern medical literature and requested that Steiner review his findings once he had gathered more data. Professor Whitmore established what he considered a scientific approach to documenting Elizabeth's condition, a methodology that would produce hundreds of pages of transcriptions and observations over the following weeks. He arranged to lodge at a boarding house in Galena and visited the Porter homestead daily, often remaining for hours to observe and record the girls' episodes. His journals from this period reveal a mind struggling to reconcile empirical observation with rational explanation. The professor developed a system for his documentation, noting the time each episode began and ended, the approximate duration, any apparent triggers, and detailed phonetic transcriptions of everything Elizabeth said. He brought with him reference materials on ancient languages and spent his evenings in his rented room attempting to translate the day's recordings. What emerged from this painstaking work was deeply troubling to a man of science and reason. Whitmore identified at least 4 distinct ancient languages appearing in Elizabeth's utterances: Aramaic, which he knew well from biblical studies, ancient Greek in what appeared to be Koine dialect, fragments of Akkadian, an ancient Mesopotamian language, and what he tentatively identified as Coptic, the latest form of the Egyptian language. More disturbing than the mere presence of these languages was the accuracy of their grammar and syntax. These were not random sounds that happened to resemble ancient words, but properly constructed phrases following linguistic rules that took scholars years of study to master. Dr. Blackwell continued his medical monitoring throughout this period, examining Elizabeth before and after episodes, checking for any physical changes that might explain her condition. His records show increasing frustration as every test available to frontier medicine produced normal results. The child appeared healthy by all measurable standards, yet something was clearly terribly wrong. Professor Whitmore began corresponding with linguistic colleagues, sending transcriptions and requesting verification of his translations. The responses, preserved in university archives, show initial skepticism, giving way to confused acknowledgement that the transcriptions did indeed appear to be authentic ancient languages. Pastor Walsh's sermons during this period, reconstructed from notes kept by congregation members, began to reference spiritual warfare and testing of faith, reflecting his own struggle to understand what was happening to the child. As March drew toward its end, Professor Whitmore's translations of Elizabeth's utterances began to reveal content that transformed his scientific interest into something approaching dread. His journal entries show the change clearly, the careful academic language giving way to expressions of unease and even fear. The phrases Elizabeth spoke, once translated, were not random or nonsensical. They contained disturbing coherence, speaking of the deep places, of those who wait beneath, of the opening of ways. Whitmore wrote to Dr. Tyner that the content suggested knowledge of ancient mythologies and cosmologies that even educated scholars rarely encountered, let alone understood. The girl spoke of entities and concepts that appeared in Mesopotamian texts, in pre-Christian Gnostic writings, in fragments of Egyptian burial literature. How she accessed this information remained utterly inexplicable. The physical manifestation of Elizabeth's episodes also began to change in late March, taking on increasingly violent characteristics. Martha Porter's letters to her sister describe episodes where Elizabeth convulsed as if in pain, her body twisting in ways that seemed to cause her genuine agony. More disturbing were the marks that began appearing on her skin during and after these episodes. Dr. Blackwell's medical notes document scratches, bruises, and lesions that appeared without apparent external cause. On one occasion, Martha wrote that she had watched her daughter claw at her own arms during an episode, drawing blood while speaking continuously in an unknown language. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. Dr. Blackwell's expanded examination found no medical explanation for the lesions beyond the obvious self-inflicted wounds, but even those seemed excessive for the brief periods during which Elizabeth lost control. The family made the difficult decision to limit visitors after a particularly disturbing episode on March 28th. According to multiple witnesses, including Professor Whitmore and Pastor Walsh, Elizabeth had been sitting quietly when she suddenly began speaking in what Whitmore later identified as a dialect of ancient Greek. The content, when translated, consisted of detailed descriptions of methods of execution used in the ancient world, information no 12-year-old should possess. Then the girl had collapsed, and when the witnesses rushed to her aid, they found unexplained bruising around her throat as if invisible hands had choked her. Professor Whitmore's letter to Dr. Steiner, written that night, shows a man whose scientific worldview was crumbling. Word of Elizabeth Porter's affliction spread through Stone County, despite the family's desire for privacy. And by April of 1893, the case had become a subject of widespread speculation and fear. The Galena Weekly Gazette, the local newspaper, published a sensationalized account on April 6th under the headline, "Local Girl Afflicted by Strange Malady Speaks in Tongues of the Ancients." The article, while factually inaccurate in many details, captured enough truth to ignite public imagination and concern. Copies of this newspaper, preserved in historical archives, show how quickly the story spread beyond Stone County, picked up by papers in Springfield, and even as far as St. Louis. The community's response was mixed and reflected the complex interplay of religious belief, superstition, and fear that characterized frontier life. Some residents viewed Elizabeth's condition as a divine gift, interpreting her utterances as evidence of holy possession or prophetic ability. Others saw it as demonic, a sign of Satan's influence in their midst. Most simply found it frightening, something unnatural that violated the normal order of their world. Pastor Jeremiah Walsh's sermons during this period, reconstructed from notes and memories of congregation members, took on increasingly apocalyptic tones. He spoke of the thin veil between the material and spiritual worlds, of tests of faith, of the reality of forces beyond human understanding. A prayer circle formed among concerned church members who met regularly to pray for Elizabeth's deliverance, though, notably, none of them volunteered to visit the Porter homestead to pray in the girl's presence. Neighboring families began to avoid the Porters, crossing the road to avoid passing too close to their property, making excuses when Martha Porter came to town for supplies. Elizabeth's former schoolmates were forbidden by their parents from mentioning her name, as if speaking of her might somehow spread the contagion. Sheriff Daniel Carmichael, responding to vague concerns about public safety, made an official visit to the Porter homestead on April 12th. His report, filed with county records, documented that he found no evidence of criminal activity or danger to the community. However, his personal notes, discovered years later among his papers, described an atmosphere of oppression about the place that he found deeply unsettling, though he could not articulate exactly what created this impression. The arrival of Madame Celeste Devereaux in mid-April brought a new and controversial dimension to the case. Devereaux was a spiritualist from Kansas City who claimed extensive experience with spirit communication and psychic disturbances. She had learned of the Porter case through newspaper accounts and traveled to Stone County uninvited, presenting herself at the Porter homestead and offering her services. Her background, as documented in city records and newspaper archives, showed a history of conducting seances and spiritual consultations throughout Missouri and Kansas. Whether she was a genuine believer in her abilities or a calculating fraud remains unclear, but her impact on the case was undeniable. After some initial resistance, Robert and Martha Porter agreed to allow Madame Devereaux to attempt contact with whatever forces might be affecting their daughter. The séance was held on the evening of the 18th of April, 1893, in the Porters' modest parlor. Those present included Madame Devereaux, Professor Whitmore, who attended reluctantly in the interest of documentation, Dr. Blackwell, Pastor Walsh, and the Porter parents. Elizabeth was brought into the room and seated at the table. Professor Whitmore's journal provides the most detailed account of what transpired over the next 2 hours. Madame Devereaux began with standard spiritualist procedures, dimming the lamps, instructing participants to join hands around the table, calling out to any spirits present to make themselves known. For several minutes, nothing happened beyond the woman's theatrical invocations. Then Elizabeth, who had been sitting quietly with her head bowed, suddenly raised her face and began speaking in what Whitmore recognized as Aramaic. But this was different from her previous episodes. The girl appeared to be responding to Madame Devereaux's questions, creating what seemed like a dialogue between the spiritualist and whatever spoke through the child. The content, Whitmore noted with growing horror, consisted of descriptions of things from before the flood, of names that burn, of places beneath the earth where certain entities waited. Then, the phenomena escalated beyond language. According to all witnesses, mirrors in the room shattered simultaneously, though no one had touched them. Oil lamps extinguished themselves despite there being no wind or apparent cause. Most disturbing, Elizabeth began speaking in multiple languages at once, her voice seeming to layer and echo as if several people spoke through her mouth simultaneously. The aftermath of the séance marked a clear turning point in Elizabeth's condition and in the community's response to her case. Madame Devereaux fled the Porter homestead in terror that same night, leaving Stone County the following day without collecting payment for her services. Her statement to the Galena Weekly Gazette, published before her departure, claimed that the child was a doorway to something that should not be opened and that she wanted no further involvement in the matter. Professor Whitmore's journal entries from late April show a man struggling with the collapse of his rational worldview, writing that he had witnessed phenomena that should not exist according to natural philosophy. Pastor Walsh, despite his Baptist denomination's prohibition of such practices, administered what amounted to last rites over Elizabeth as she lay unconscious following the séance, her body cold to the touch though she still breathed shallowly. The child remained unconscious for 18 hours, during which Dr. Blackwell could find no medical explanation for her state and privately feared she would not wake. When Elizabeth finally regained consciousness on the morning of April 19th, she appeared weak and disoriented, but claimed to remember nothing of the seance. However, the episodes that had previously lasted minutes now sometimes continued for hours. The girl's physical condition began to deteriorate in ways that alarmed Dr. Blackwell. Despite his inability to identify any disease process, his medical notes from late April through May document progressive weight loss, periods of catatonia alternating with episodes of frenzied activity, and a general wasting that suggested serious illness, though every examination showed no organic cause. Elizabeth's diet became erratic, as she would refuse food for days, then consume large quantities as if starving. Her sleep patterns became severely disrupted, with Martha Porter reporting that her daughter would lie awake all night, speaking quietly in unknown languages as if holding conversations with unseen entities. The fragmentary diary entries Elizabeth managed to record during brief periods of lucidity grew increasingly disturbing. On April 25th, she wrote, "They show me the deep places. They make me speak their words. I am not alone inside anymore." Martha Porter's letters to her sister during this period reveal a mother's anguish as she watched her daughter fade before her eyes. By early June of 1893, Elizabeth Porter's condition had deteriorated to the point where her parents faced an agonizing decision. Dr. Blackwell, having exhausted the limited medical interventions available in Frontier, Missouri, recommended consultation with specialists at larger medical facilities. Professor Whitmore had already withdrawn from his study of the case. His final journal entry dated May 28th, stating that he had come seeking linguistic curiosity, but left convinced they had touched something beyond natural philosophy. Into this crisis came Pastor Jeremiah Walsh, with a controversial proposal. Despite his Baptist denomination's traditional rejection of such practices, the pastor had become convinced that Elizabeth's affliction was spiritual in nature and required spiritual intervention. He contacted Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest from Springfield known for his knowledge of exorcism rites, and requested his assistance. Father O'Brien arrived in Galena on June 4th, accompanied by his assistant, Brother Timothy, carrying with him the Rituale Romanum, the Catholic Manual of Exorcism Procedures. The priest's background, documented in church archives, showed experience with cases of claimed possession, though his private letters suggest he had never encountered anything like the Porter case. Father O'Brien spent June 4th interviewing the family, examining Elizabeth during one of her episodes, and consulting with Dr. Blackwell and Pastor Walsh. His official report to his bishop, preserved in Catholic diocesan records, describes a case that fit many classical signs of possession: knowledge of languages never learned, physical phenomena without natural explanation, apparent communication with non-corporeal entities, violent aversion to sacred objects and prayers. The attempted exorcism began on the morning of June 5th in Elizabeth's bedroom. Present were Father O'Brien, Brother Timothy, Pastor Walsh, Dr. Blackwell, and the girl's parents. The priest's account describes following standard procedures: prayers of protection, sprinkling of holy water, invocations commanding any possessing entity to reveal itself and depart. Elizabeth's response was immediate and violent. According to all witnesses, she began speaking in fluent Latin, a language she had never studied, directly addressing Father O'Brien and revealing knowledge of his private sins and personal tragedies that she could not have known through natural means. The room grew intensely cold despite the June heat, cold enough that witnesses could see their breath. The decision to commit Elizabeth Porter to the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum in Fulton came after the failed exorcism left her parents with no remaining options. Father O'Brien's recommendation that the child be institutionalized for her own safety, combined with Dr. Blackwell's medical opinion that she required care beyond what her family could provide, led Robert and Martha Porter to make the heartbreaking choice in mid-June 1893. The asylum, operated by the state of Missouri, was the primary facility for treating mental illness in the region, though its methods remained primitive by modern standards, and its reputation was mixed at best. Sheriff Daniel Carmichael's report documenting Elizabeth's transport to Fulton on June 18th provides disturbing details about the journey. According to the sheriff, the girl remained quiet for most of the train ride from Springfield to Fulton, sitting between her parents and staring out the window. However, during a brief period when her parents stepped away, she spoke to Sheriff Carmichael in what she claimed was his deceased mother's voice. The sheriff's written account, found among his personal papers, describes how she revealed information about his childhood that only his mother would have known, specific details about a hidden injury he had sustained at age 7 and never told anyone about, words his mother had spoken to him on her deathbed. Carmichael wrote that he spent the remainder of the journey trying to convince himself the girl had somehow learned this information through normal means, but he never fully succeeded. The admission records at Fulton, signed by Dr. Harrison Webb, the asylum superintendent, show Elizabeth Porter was committed on the 19th of June, 1893, with an initial diagnosis of hysteria of unknown origin with linguistic abnormalities. Dr. Webb, whose personal papers were donated to the Missouri State Archives after his death in 1921, showed immediate fascination with the case. His early notes describe a girl who appeared entirely normal between episodes, polite and cooperative, even helping other patients and assisting attendants with ward duties. Elizabeth wrote letters home during these lucid periods, reassuring her parents that she was being treated well and expressing hope that the doctors could help her. However, the night attendants reported phenomena that troubled even experienced asylum staff. The months Elizabeth Porter spent at the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum in Fulton, from June through October of 1893, generated extensive documentation that provides our most detailed window into her final decline. Dr. Harrison Webb's case file grew remarkably thick as he meticulously recorded observations of his most unusual patient. His notes show a physician torn between scientific curiosity and growing unease. Elizabeth's behavior followed a pattern during her time at Fulton. During daylight hours, particularly when staff were present, she often appeared entirely normal. A quiet 12-year-old girl who read books from the asylum library, wrote letters to her parents, and participated in the limited activities available to patients in the women's ward. Attendants described her during these periods as almost unnaturally still, like something waiting, a phrase that appears repeatedly in their logs. But after dark, when the wards were locked and lamps dimmed, the episodes would begin. Night nurse Agnes Porter, no relation to Elizabeth's family, kept detailed logs that document the girl speaking for hours in the darkness, carrying on conversations with entities no one else could see, her voice alternating between the high pitch of a child and tones impossibly deep and resonant. Other patients in the women's ward began showing disturbed behavior shortly after Elizabeth's arrival. Previously stable women started experiencing nightmares, claiming to see figures standing in corners of rooms, reporting voices whispering in languages they did not understand. 3 patients attempted self-harm during July and August, cutting themselves with any sharp object they could find while muttering about needing to let something out. Dr. Webb noted these incidents but struggled to establish a direct connection to Elizabeth, though the correlation was difficult to ignore. A visiting doctor from Johns Hopkins, Dr. William Hammond, examined Elizabeth in mid-August at Dr. Webb's invitation. His published paper, appearing in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in late 1893, suggested dissociative identity disorder as a possible explanation, proposing that trauma or stress had fractured the girl's personality into multiple identities, some of which had created elaborate linguistic constructs. However, Dr. Hammond's private correspondence with Dr. Webb, preserved in medical archives, reveals he remained deeply confused by aspects of the case that did not fit this diagnosis, particularly the accuracy of the ancient languages and the physical phenomena. The final episode that ended Elizabeth Porter's life occurred on the night of the 17th of October, 1893, and was documented by multiple witnesses whose accounts, while varying in details, agree on the essential horror of what transpired. The incident began around 7 p.m. during the evening meal in the women's ward. According to attendant Sarah Mitchell's log, Elizabeth had been sitting quietly at the dining table when she suddenly stood, her body becoming rigid, her eyes rolling back. Then she began speaking in what witnesses described as multiple voices simultaneously, a cacophony of ancient languages pouring from her mouth in an impossible chorus. Dr. Webb, summoned immediately, arrived to find the entire women's ward in chaos. Patients were screaming, several attempting to harm themselves. One elderly woman collapsed and would die within the hour of what the death certificate listed as heart failure, but what witnesses described as terror so intense it stopped her heart. Elizabeth stood in the center of the ward, her body contorted in positions that Dr. Webb's report described as physically impossible for a human spine to achieve. The speaking continued for 7 hours without pause, Elizabeth's voice never growing hoarse or weak despite the continuous vocalization. Attendants who tried to physically restrain her reported that her skin was ice cold and that touching her produced a sensation like electric shock. Dr. Webb administered sedatives in doses that should have rendered her unconscious, but they produced no effect whatsoever. Multiple witnesses described the air around Elizabeth as shimmering like heat waves. Though the room was cold, objects in the ward moved without being touched, beds sliding across floors, metal bedpans clattering. But the most disturbing aspect, noted by every witness, was Elizabeth's eyes. When they briefly rolled forward into normal position, they appeared to be looking at something in the air that only she could see, tracking movement across the ceiling and walls, her gaze filled with what Dr. Webb described as recognition and terrible understanding. Professor Owen Whitmore, contacted after the fact and provided with phonetic transcriptions of some of Elizabeth's final utterances, later translated a repeated phrase as, "The door is opening. We are coming through. This vessel breaks." At 11:47 p.m., Elizabeth suddenly stopped speaking mid-word, her body went limp, and she collapsed. Dr. Webb pronounced her dead at the scene. The death of Elizabeth Porter at age 12 prompted an official county inquest, as required by law for any unexpected death in an institution. The inquest, held in Fulton on the 20th of October 1893, heard testimony from Dr. Harrison Webb, attending staff, and reviewing the limited medical evidence available. The official ruling, recorded in county records, determined death by natural causes complicated by hysteria and mania, a conclusion that satisfied legal requirements but left profound questions unanswered. The autopsy, performed by Dr. Webb himself with assistance from a colleague, found no physical cause of death. The girl's organs appeared normal, showing no disease or injury that might explain her sudden demise. However, Dr. Webb's private notes, not included in the official report, described the body as appearing as one dead for days rather than hours, with a level of rigor mortis and tissue degradation inconsistent with the actual time since death. Her body was released to her parents on October 21st, and they transported her remains back to Stone County for burial. The funeral, held at the Baptist Church in Galena on October 23rd, was sparsely attended. Many in the community remained fearful even of Elizabeth's corpse, crossing themselves as the simple pine casket was carried into the church. Pastor Jeremiah Walsh delivered a eulogy that spoke of a child caught between worlds, a soul tested beyond endurance, and the mysteries of faith that surpass human understanding. His sermon notes, preserved in church archives, show revisions where he struggled to find words that would provide comfort without denying the horror of what had occurred. Elizabeth was buried in the church cemetery under a simple stone marker bearing only her name and the years of her birth and death. The grave's location, in a far corner of the cemetery away from other plots, reflected the community's continued unease about her case. Professor Owen Whitmore, learning of Elizabeth's death through newspaper accounts, experienced what his colleagues described as a profound crisis. He returned to his transcriptions and notes, spending months attempting to complete translations and compile a comprehensive account of the case. His resulting monograph, titled The Porter Case, Linguistic Anomaly or Supernatural Phenomenon, presented all his evidence and observations while carefully avoiding any definitive conclusion about the nature of what he had witnessed. In the years following Elizabeth Porter's death, the case faded from public consciousness with remarkable speed, becoming one of those strange frontier stories that existed more as rumor than documented fact. The reasons for this obscurity were multiple and overlapping. First, the disruptions of the era, including economic depression in the 1890 seconds, the Spanish-American War, and the general chaos of rapid industrialization, pushed local mysteries aside in favor of larger national concerns. Second, those most intimately involved with the case had strong motivations to let it be forgotten. The Porter family sold their Stone County homestead in early 1894, moving to Oklahoma Territory and cutting all ties with Missouri and their former life. Robert Porter's land sale records show he accepted far less than the property's value, suggesting desperation to leave quickly. Martha Porter's final letter to her sister, dated March 1894, stated simply that they needed to start fresh in a place where no one knew their sorrow. The family never spoke publicly of Elizabeth again, and when Martha died in 1909, her obituary in an Oklahoma newspaper made no mention of her daughter's case, listing only that she had lost a child in youth. Dr. Samuel Blackwell's medical practice in Galena suffered following the case, as parents grew reluctant to bring their children to the doctor who couldn't help the Porter girl. His journals from this period, discovered among his effects after his death in 1903, show a man haunted by his inability to provide medical explanation or treatment. He left Stone County in 1896, relocating to a small practice in Arkansas, and his final journal entry mentioning Elizabeth, written in 1902, expressed hope that whatever had afflicted her had died with her and would not manifest in others. Pastor Jeremiah Walsh's sermons gradually stopped referencing the case, though his private correspondence suggests he never stopped thinking about it. Professor Owen Whitmore's attempts to publish his findings met with consistent rejection from academic journals. Editors found the material too sensational, too lacking in scientific rigor, or simply too disturbing to print. His final attempt to interest a publisher came in 1895, after which he apparently abandoned the effort. University records show Whitmore's teaching became erratic, his research unfocused, and he resigned his position in 1896. The decades between Elizabeth Porter's death in 1893 and the eventual rediscovery of her case in the late 1940s represent a period during which the story existed primarily in fragmentary and distorted forms. The physical evidence and documentation scattered, deteriorated, or was deliberately destroyed, while oral tradition preserved only garbled versions of events. The Porter homestead in Stone County stood empty for several years after the family's departure, gradually gaining a reputation as haunted. Local teenagers, drawn by the forbidden nature of the place, would dare each other to approach the house at night, spawning stories of strange sounds and ghostly apparitions. By 1900, the property had been sold to a family unaware of its history who demolished the original house after repeated vandalism and built a new structure on a different part of the land. Professor Whitmore's papers, containing his detailed transcriptions and observations, were donated to Washington University's archives after his death in 1912 at the request of his sister, who was clearing out his effects. The papers were filed away unread, cataloged simply as linguistic studies, their connection to the Porter case not immediately apparent. Dr. Blackwell's journals ended up in an estate sale after his death, purchased by a collector of medical antiquities who stored them in a trunk without examining them closely. Pastor Walsh's church records remained in the Baptist church's basement until a fire in 1918 destroyed much of the building, including many historical documents. What survived was later moved to various archives without systematic organization. The asylum records at Fulton, which contained Dr. Webb's detailed observations of Elizabeth's final months, were largely destroyed when the facility burned in 1897, just 4 years after her death. Official reports survive in state archives, but the detailed daily logs and Dr. Webb's personal notes were lost in the fire. Elizabeth's grave in the Galena Cemetery remained marked until sometime in the 1922, when the original stone was vandalized and removed, leaving the burial site unmarked and its exact location a matter of fading memory among older residents. The case did survive in local folklore, but in forms that bore little resemblance to the documented events. The 930 seconds, Works Progress Administration Project to document Ozark folklore collected several versions of what they called the girl who spoke in devil tongues, stories that had acquired supernatural embellishments, claims of levitation, predictions of disasters, and other elements not present in the original accounts. These distorted versions, published in regional folklore collections, became the primary way the story was transmitted through the mid-20th century, treated as colorful legend rather than documented historical event. A few scholars encountered references to the case in their research, but found insufficient documentation to pursue it seriously. A 1938 paper on frontier medicine mentioned the Porter case in a footnote as an example of misdiagnosed epilepsy, based solely on the brief newspaper accounts. The fragmentation of sources meant that no single researcher had access to enough material to reconstruct the full story. Professor Whitmore's transcriptions sat in one archive, Dr. Blackwell's journals in private hands, asylum records largely destroyed, and the family itself vanished into anonymity in Oklahoma. Without a central repository of information or an investigator willing to track down scattered sources, the case remained obscure, known to a few specialists in isolated fragments but understood by no one in its terrible entirety. The physical locations associated with the case gradually changed beyond recognition. The schoolhouse where Elizabeth had been a student was closed in 1920 when school consolidation moved education to larger facilities in Galena proper. The building was converted to a storage barn and eventually collapsed in the 1950 seconds. The Baptist church where she had worshipped and where her funeral was held was rebuilt after the 1918 fire in a different architectural style, erasing the physical space she had known. Even the landscape changed as roads were improved, forests cleared for farming, and the isolated character of the region diminished. By 1946, when a young graduate student would stumble across the first threads of the story, the case of Elizabeth Porter existed only in fragments scattered across Missouri and beyond, a puzzle waiting for someone with the patience and dedication to reassemble it. The rediscovery of the Elizabeth Porter case began almost accidentally in 1946 when Margaret Hollis, a graduate student in linguistics at the University of Missouri, was conducting research on 19th-century American linguistic studies for her master's thesis. While examining the archives at Washington University in St. Louis, she came across a box labeled Whitmore Linguistic Papers 1880 to 1895 and began reviewing the contents for potential relevance to her research. Among the expected academic materials, translations of ancient texts, comparative grammar studies, she found a series of journals and loose papers documenting something called the Stone County Case. Hollis's initial interest was purely academic, intrigued by the linguistic aspects of what appeared to be a case of xenoglossy, speaking in languages never learned. However, as she read further into Professor Whitmore's detailed transcriptions and increasingly troubled observations, her research focus shifted entirely. What had begun as a footnote to her thesis became an obsession that would consume the next 17 years of her life. Hollis's methodology was painstaking and systematic. She created a timeline of events based on Whitmore's papers, then began searching for corroborating sources. County records in Stone County yielded the original newspaper accounts and the inquest report. Church archives provided Pastor Walsh's records and sermon notes. The Missouri State Archives held what remained of the asylum documentation. Each source led to others, creating a web of evidence that Hollis meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced. In 1948, she placed advertisements in newspapers throughout Missouri and Oklahoma seeking information about the Porter family, resulting in contact with Martha Porter's great-niece, who had inherited a trunk of family papers. Among these were Martha's letters to her sister and, most significantly, fragments of Elizabeth's diary, water-damaged and incomplete, but legible enough to provide the girl's own voice describing her terror and confusion. Hollis conducted interviews with anyone who might have knowledge of the case. In 1951, she located Dr. Blackwell's journals in the collection of a medical historian in Little Rock, Arkansas, who agreed to loan them for her research. The same year, she found and interviewed the last surviving eyewitness to the events, Sarah Mitchell, the former asylum attendant, then 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Columbia, Missouri. Mitchell's interview, recorded on one of the early wire recorders, provides some of the most disturbing details never included in official records. Sarah Mitchell's testimony, given to Margaret Hollis in a nursing home room in Columbia in the summer of 1951, provided details about Elizabeth Porter's final months that had never appeared in any official documentation. Mitchell was 89 years old, her memory for recent events failing, but her recollection of the events at Fulton Asylum in 1893 remained sharp and obviously troubling. The wire recording of this interview, preserved in the University of Missouri archives, captures a woman's voice still shaken by events that had occurred nearly 6 decades earlier. Mitchell described nights working in the women's ward when Elizabeth would speak for hours in darkness, the content of which Mitchell admitted she had never reported to her supervisors out of fear they would think her mad. The girl spoke, Mitchell said, of places beneath the earth that existed before human time, of entities that waited in those places for doors to open, of names that caused physical pain when Elizabeth pronounced them. Mitchell claimed that listening to the girl during these episodes produced severe headaches and a sense of oppression that made it difficult to breathe. Other patients would wake screaming from nightmares they could not remember, or would be found huddled in corners of their rooms trying to block out sounds only they could hear. Most disturbing to Mitchell was Elizabeth's knowledge of things she should not have known. The girl would speak to attendants about their private lives, their deceased relatives, their secret shames, all while seeming to look through them rather than at them. Mitchell described one incident, not in any official report, when Elizabeth had told her in perfect detail about Mitchell's stillborn son, buried 15 years earlier, including the child's name, which Mitchell had never told anyone at the asylum. When Mitchell asked how she could know such things, Elizabeth had replied in a voice that did not sound like her own. "We know everything that touches the deep places. All deaths lead down to where we wait." Mitchell's final statement to Hollis, delivered with visible emotion, was her confession that sometimes at night, even after all these years, she still heard Elizabeth's voice speaking words that hurt to remember. She expressed relief at finally telling someone the full truth, something she had been too frightened to do while working at the asylum for fear of losing her position or being thought insane. This deathbed interview provided Hollis with crucial details that connected scattered pieces of evidence and confirmed the genuine nature of the phenomena beyond what could be explained by fraud or mass hysteria. Margaret Hollis completed her doctoral dissertation, Speaking the Unspeakable, the Elizabeth Porter Case Reconsidered, in 1963. After 17 years of research that had taken her from archives to interviews to the physical locations where events had occurred, the dissertation, over 400 pages including extensive appendices of source documents, represented the first comprehensive examination of the case since Professor Whitmore's rejected monograph of 1895. Hollis's approach was deliberately cautious, presenting all available evidence while refusing to draw supernatural conclusions, instead offering multiple possible explanations and acknowledging the limitations of historical research. Her work documented the case's medical aspects, the linguistic evidence, the psychological dimensions, and the social context of 19th-century rural Missouri, creating a framework that allowed serious scholarly engagement with a case that had been dismissed as folklore. The dissertation was accepted by her committee, with some reluctance, several members expressing discomfort with the subject matter, but the quality of the research and documentation was undeniable. Following the completion of her doctorate, Hollis published several academic articles drawing on her research, appearing in journals of linguistics, medical history, and psychology. These publications brought the case to the attention of specialists in various fields, each approaching it through their disciplinary lens. Linguists focused on the xenoglossy aspect, debating whether the transcriptions truly represented accurate ancient languages or were elaborate glossolalia that happened to resemble real linguistic structures. Psychiatrists and psychologists proposed various diagnoses, from dissociative identity disorder to temporal lobe epilepsy with unusual manifestations, though none could fully account for all documented phenomena. Medical historians examined the case as an example of 19th century diagnostic limitations and the intersection of medicine and religion in treating unexplained conditions. Paranormal researchers, occupying a more controversial space in academia, seized on the case as potential evidence of genuine possession or contact with non-human intelligence. The variety of interpretations reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality and the limits of natural explanation. In 1967, Hollis organized a symposium at the University of Missouri, bringing together scholars from multiple disciplines to examine the evidence and debate interpretations. The proceedings, published in 1968, showed the range of perspectives while revealing how difficult it was to reach any consensus about a case that challenged multiple forms of conventional understanding simultaneously. The legacy of the Elizabeth Porter case extends across multiple fields of study and continues to generate research and debate more than a century after the girl's death. Linguistic analysis of Professor Whitmore's transcriptions, conducted using modern analytical methods, has confirmed that the utterances do indeed conform to the grammatical structures of the ancient languages he identified. A 2001 study published in the Journal of Ancient Languages examined the Aramaic passages and found them to be grammatically accurate and syntactically complex, using verb forms and vocabulary that would require years of specialized study to master. The study's authors, while refusing to speculate on how a 12-year-old frontier girl accessed this knowledge, acknowledged that conventional explanations such as cryptomnesia or hidden memories fail to account for the linguistic sophistication displayed. Similar analyses of the Greek, Akkadian, and Coptic fragments have produced comparable results, leading some linguists to describe the case as the most compelling historical example of xenoglossy on record. While others continue to search for naturalistic explanations, medical and psychiatric literature has proposed numerous diagnoses for Elizabeth's condition. Temporal lobe epilepsy remains a popular explanation, as this form of seizure disorder can produce altered states of consciousness, personality changes, and sometimes the illusion of speaking in unknown languages. However, neurologists examining the historical evidence note that the duration and characteristics of Elizabeth's episodes exceed typical epileptic patterns. Dissociative identity disorder has been proposed, building on Dr. Hammond's 19th century suggestion, with modern theorists suggesting that severe trauma fractured Elizabeth's personality and created alternate identities that expressed themselves through elaborate linguistic constructs. Critics of this theory point to the accuracy of the languages and the physical phenomena as inconsistent with psychological dissociation alone. A 2015 paper in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry proposed a rare form of autoimmune encephalitis that can cause psychiatric symptoms and altered consciousness, though the authors admitted this was speculation, given the impossibility of testing the hypothesis on a patient dead for over a century. Paranormal researchers have investigated locations associated with the case with mixed results. The former site of the Porter homestead, now part of a larger property, has been examined multiple times since the 1972. Modern paranormal investigations of sites associated with the Elizabeth Porter case have produced results that believers find compelling and skeptics dismiss as subjective interpretation or equipment malfunction. Teams equipped with electronic voice phenomenon recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, and infrared cameras have visited the former Porter homestead site, Elizabeth's unmarked grave location, and the area where the Fulton Asylum once stood. Multiple investigators have reported unusual electromagnetic fluctuations at the grave site, electronic recording devices capturing sounds that some interpret as voices speaking in unknown languages, and equipment failures that occur without apparent technical cause. A 2008 investigation documented on video shows several instances of what appear to be voices on audio recordings made at the cemetery, though analysis has not determined whether these represent genuine anomalies or are artifacts of electronic interference and audio pareidolia. Skeptical investigators examining the same locations have generally found nothing unusual, leading to the typical impasse between those convinced of paranormal activity and those attributing all findings to natural causes, equipment issues, or wishful interpretation. More concrete were the findings of a 2012 forensic anthropology project that received permission to exhume and examine Elizabeth's remains. The exhumation took place in July 2012, with a team from the University of Missouri conducting the examination under controlled conditions. The forensic report documented several unusual findings that added new dimensions to the case. The skeletal remains showed patterns of stress markers indicating periods of extreme physiological distress, consistent with the documented episodes of convulsions and physical torment. More puzzling were unusual patterns in the bone structure itself, described in the report as consistent with extreme and prolonged stress of a type not typically seen in juvenile remains. The team found evidence of multiple healed fractures in the fingers and hands, suggesting repeated trauma, and microscopic analysis revealed cellular patterns the forensic pathologists described as anomalous, but could not definitively explain. One team member noted privately that certain characteristics of the remains seemed inconsistent with normal bone development and degradation, as if the skeleton had experienced stresses beyond what human physiology should produce. These findings, while not proving supernatural causation, added to the body of evidence that Elizabeth had experienced something genuinely unusual and physically traumatic. Current locations of key evidence reflect the scattered nature of sources that Margaret Hollis worked so hard to bring together. The question that has troubled every serious investigator of the Elizabeth Porter case remains fundamentally unanswered, despite over a century of examination, speculation, and research. Was this a case of misunderstood medical illness? A neurological or psychiatric condition that 19th century medicine lacked the knowledge to properly diagnose and that produced symptoms which seemed inexplicable to contemporary observers? The evidence for this interpretation includes the fact that many conditions now recognized by modern medicine were unknown in 1893, and what seemed supernatural to frontier doctors might have been merely rare pathology. Temporal lobe epilepsy, autoimmune encephalitis, and certain psychiatric disorders can produce altered consciousness, personality changes, and even the production of complex vocalizations that might be mistaken for foreign languages. However, this explanation struggles to account for the documented accuracy of the ancient languages Elizabeth spoke, the physical phenomena witnessed by multiple credible observers, and the knowledge she displayed of information she could not have accessed through normal means. A second interpretation suggests mass hysteria or collective delusion, where initial symptoms in the child, perhaps seizures or psychological distress, were amplified and distorted by the expectations and fears of those around her. In this reading, Professor Whitmore, predisposed to find linguistic patterns, interpreted random vocalizations as ancient languages. Witnesses at the seance and exorcism, primed by religious and cultural beliefs about possession, experienced and reported phenomena influenced by suggestion and expectation rather than objective reality. This explanation accounts for the escalation of reported phenomena over time and the involvement of increasingly dramatic interventions, each building on previous expectations. However, it fails to explain the consistency of linguistic patterns across multiple observers, the physical evidence such as the marks on Elizabeth's body, and the post-mortem findings. A third interpretation, embraced by some paranormal researchers and rejected by mainstream academia, proposes genuine supernatural possession or contact with non-human entities. This reading takes the historical accounts at face value, accepting that Elizabeth became a conduit for forces or beings beyond current scientific understanding. The accurate ancient languages, the knowledge of hidden information, the physical phenomena, and the deeply disturbing content of her utterances all point, in this view, to genuine intrusion of the supernatural into the natural world. The physical landscape where the Elizabeth Porter case unfolded has changed dramatically in the 130 years since her death, yet certain places retain associations with her story that local residents have not entirely forgotten. The town of Galena, Missouri, remains a small community in Stone County, now bypassed by major highways and largely dependent on tourism related to the nearby Table Rock Lake. The Baptist church where Elizabeth's funeral was held was rebuilt after a fire and remodeled several times, bearing no physical resemblance to the structure she knew. The church cemetery, however, still exists, expanded over the decades, but retaining its oldest section where Elizabeth was buried. Her grave's exact location was lost when the original marker was destroyed, though local historians and Margaret Hollis's research narrowed it to a specific area in the cemetery's southwest corner. In 2013, the Stone County Historical Society placed a new marker in the approximate location, a simple stone bearing Elizabeth's name, dates, and the inscription, "A child lost to mysteries beyond understanding." The marker has become a minor point of interest for those aware of the case, with occasional visitors leaving flowers or small tokens. Some visitors have reported an persistent sense of unease in that corner of the cemetery, a feeling that has no obvious source but affects even those unaware of the grave's significance. The area where the Porter homestead once stood is now part of a larger tract of private land. The original structure's long gone, and the exact location marked only by some irregularities in the ground, and a few foundation stones visible to those who know where to look. The current landowners, aware of the property's history, have generally discouraged investigators and curiosity seekers, though occasional trespassers still attempt to visit the site. Local folklore has attached various stories to the location, most embellished beyond recognition, but the core memory persists that something terrible happened there. The site of the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum in Fulton, where Elizabeth spent her final months, is now occupied by a state mental health facility that has gone through numerous reorganizations and name changes. The original 19th century buildings were largely destroyed in the 1897 fire, and subsequent construction has completely transformed the physical plant. The case of Elizabeth Porter stands as a reminder that reality contains spaces where our explanatory frameworks fail, where the documented evidence resists simple categorization as either purely natural or purely supernatural. What happened to a 12-year-old girl in the Missouri Ozarks in 1893 challenged the understanding of everyone who encountered it, from frontier doctors to university professors, from clergy to asylum superintendents. Each brought their disciplinary tools and cultural assumptions to bear on the mystery, and each ultimately admitted the inadequacy of their explanations. Perhaps the most honest response is to acknowledge that some historical events resist the closure of definitive interpretation, remaining instead as questions that disturb our certainty about the nature of human experience and the limits of the knowable. Elizabeth Porter spoke in languages she should not have known, displayed knowledge she could not have accessed, and experienced phenomena that witnesses found impossible to explain through reference to ordinary causation. Whether these facts point to misunderstood illness, collective delusion, or genuine contact with realities beyond the material world may ultimately matter less than what the case reveals about the limits of human understanding. We construct explanatory frameworks, medical, psychological, religious, paranormal, to contain and make sense of disturbing events, but sometimes the frameworks prove inadequate and the mystery persists. In the hills of Stone County, where the autumn wind moves through the trees and shadows gather early in the hollows, the memory of Elizabeth Porter endures not as solved case, but as enduring question. The weathered gravestone placed in 2013 marks not just a burial site, but a boundary between what we can explain and what continues to elude explanation. Visitors standing at that spot, whether believers in the supernatural or committed skeptics, often report the same unsettling sensation, a feeling that something in this place remains unresolved, that the door Elizabeth spoke of opening has never been entirely closed. The earth around her grave, as multiple observers have documented, remains peculiar in one respect that seems too consistent to be coincidence. Nothing grows there. Not grass, not weeds, not the persistent vegetation that covers every other grave in the cemetery. Groundskeepers have attempted seeding the area multiple times, but within weeks the bare earth returns, as if something in the soil itself rejects life. Whether this represents chemical contamination, soil compaction, or something less easily explained, it serves as a final, enduring mystery surrounding a case that generated so many others.